All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. As you all are coming in, I'd like to introduce yourself. My name is Brooke Curtis. I am one of the TA specialists here with the Florida PBIS project. And we are going to be talking about supporting our students who have some more intensive needs or more intensive behaviors and really supporting them in that classroom environment and what we can do to help sustain those interventions. But we're going to give just a couple more minutes for some people to start filtering in. So as they filter in, my lovely colleague, Betsy Lazega, is putting into the chat box a copy of today's handouts. So you can pull those up and reference them whenever you'd like. I also have with me Christy Gomez. I'll let her introduce herself real quickly.
Good morning. I'm Christy Gomez. I'm also a TA specialist with the Florida PBIS project, and I get the privilege of supporting districts in the Panhandle and Northeast Florida.
Awesome. And while everyone's coming in, if you could just take a quick moment in the chat box, let us know where you're from, what district, and what your role is, so we can kind of get an idea. Do we have classroom teachers here, counselors, district support staff? Who's in our audience today so that we can hopefully make some connections to the work that you all are doing in the districts? And then I don't have up there, I can see the chat now. All right, we got some parents here from Escambia County. Welcome. Social workers, Key Largo. I bet you it's nice and warm down there. It's kind of chilly up this way today. So welcome, welcome. Oh, we got MTSS. Welcome, Karen from Hernando. Wonderful. We got deans, beautiful, instructional. Love seeing all my people from Nassau. Welcome. I'm your TA specialist that helps support the schools up in Nassau County. All right. Well, as people come in, Betsy will keep adding the links to the handouts. As always, our chat is going to be recorded and will be posted at a later date for anybody to watch it at a later date. So hopefully you get something from today's chat or have information you want to share out with others. So again, my name is Brooke Curtis. I'm the TA specialist. I help support districts and schools up in that northeast part of the state. I'm in the St. Augustine area. And I am also a board certified behavior analyst. And so, along with some of my other colleagues here on the call, we're going to be using our expertise around FBAs and BIPs, along with Christy's expertise as a former classroom teacher and PBIS district coordinator, to really tie those two pieces together and how we can think about supporting and sustaining the interventions at that tier 3 level for student success in the classroom. And we have a really great treat for you all today because we have Rebecca Schmuck, who is out of Santa Rosa. She is the district coordinator, and she's going to share with you how they've developed some of their resources and professional learning and coaching to support this work at the classroom level. All right, thanks, Christy. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We're going to really touch briefly on some basic behavior principles, kind of so that we can all get some common language around what we're talking about when it comes to behavioral assessment, classroom practices. We'll start to develop some fluency with how to utilize some of our classroom supports or effective strategies within the classroom to help support and build up the capacity to support students who might have more intensive needs in the classroom. And then we'll wrap it up with how do we coach and support the integration of an individualized plan within those classroom structures. And as always, the resources that we're sharing with you today, our goal here is really to focus on improving student outcomes, that we're going to be talking about supporting our students who have more intensive needs, whether it's general education students or our students with disabilities, but we always encourage you to refer back to your district guidance around the practices and policies and procedures that are in place around that. Right. So we're going to get talking about what do we mean when it comes to supporting students at that tier 3 level. You all are probably familiar at this point, or many of you are familiar at this point with our MTSS triangle and our system of support. And so, really, when we're starting to get at that more intensive need of support, we're talking about those few students who need that additional support. And it's going to be that layer of support. Go ahead, Christy. And we know that we are able to support those students who have those more intensive needs when we have school-wide and class-wide systems of support that are really clearly defining what is expected. How are we teaching? How are we reinforcing? Do we have consistency in how we're responding and utilizing data to help make decisions around how to support our students? And so when we think about supporting individual students, we know that a student's successful student behavior is supported through successful classroom strategies and classroom management, and that is further supported by having that also supported when we think school-wide. So really that PBIS framework helps support students from tier 1 all the way through tier 3. All right. Again, just to kind of build that common language, we want to have both understanding when we're talking about behavior, we're encompassing that behavior includes anything that we say, things that we do, is impacted as well by our thoughts and feelings as well. But when we're getting at the assessment level, we'll really be talking about behavior being that specific action. And we have to have some other common understanding of behavior when we're going into assessment. Behavior is going to be a response to the environment. And because of that, we understand that behavior is purposeful. It can be learned. And in some situations, that behavior might be what we're calling situationally inappropriate. And so we'll start talking about that just a little bit when we talk about assessment for students at that tier 3 or at that intensive need. The other common language that I want to focus in on, and we're going to break it down a little bit for you in just a moment, is that when we're talking about classroom environment and classroom practices, we're going to focus in here today around our 5 classroom essentials, the 5 PBIS classroom essentials. We'll share some tip sheets with you all at the end for those of you who are not familiar with that. This won't be a chat where we're going to do a deep dive into that. We're going to kind of just introduce it to have that common language. But we know that classrooms that have clear expectations and rules maximize the structure around those routines, engage their students in their learning, and have that continuum of responding for both positive, appropriate behaviors as well as inappropriate behaviors. Are going to have those practices in place that are going to allow us to help support our students with those intensive needs. All right, so let's talk just real quick around what are those ABCs of behavior, or what we call behavior basics. So for those of you who may not have heard those terms before, or ABCs, what they are referring to are what is known as antecedents, behavior, and consequence. So antecedents are going to be those slow, those are things that are happening before any behavior occurs. So it's going to be things within the environment. Sometimes some of those environmental triggers might be present immediately. Some might have kind of set the stage. We call those setting events. But it's those things in the environment that increase the likelihood for behaviors to occur. We encounter antecedents every day in our everyday life. When we see a yellow stoplight, it's giving us a trigger for either hopefully slow down and stop, but in some cases you might, put your foot on the gas pedal and go quicker to get through that intersection. So the antecedents are what's happening in that environment to increase the likelihood for particular behaviors to occur. The reason we pay attention to that is because it helps us identify an intervention that we can put into place to help prevent behavior. So when we think about it, before we're even getting to that individual functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan, at the classroom level, what are things happening in the environment around how we're structuring the environment, how we're engaging our students that would help prevent behavior from occurring, which is our next piece, is those are going to be the observable actions. It lets us know what it is that we need to teach. So when we think classroom and classroom practices, we're thinking about how have we defined our expectations, rules, and routines for what we want to see. So again, before we're even starting to drill down into the individual needs of our students, we're starting to think about the needs that of our classroom, what's going to help facilitate learning for our students. And the last piece are the consequences. What's occurring immediately following behavior. And when we think about those consequences, we really want to think about things that are going to help increase those appropriate behaviors while decreasing the likelihood for more inappropriate behaviors. We focus in on that because at the individual level, it helps us understand the function or that purpose. Why is that behavior occurring? And so, again, keeping connected back to the classroom, we want to make sure that we have two systems in place. We have a system in place for acknowledging the appropriate behaviors to help increase the likelihood they continue to occur, while also having a way of responding to inappropriate behaviors to decrease the likelihood and get us back into a position of acknowledging the more appropriate behaviors. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about that function in the context of those ABCs. Again, we use this kind of sequence of looking at those things that are happening before within how we're defining that target behavior for that student that we want to see decreasing, and then looking at what are the consequences, what seems to be maintaining that behavior. And so when we put those together, and you'll hear the term a functional hypothesis or hypothesis statement if you're doing are part of an FBA team, but that's helping us get at what's maintaining that behavior. And Christy, if you could go ahead and click. And really, when we're talking about function, it's going to be two main functions of behavior. We're either doing behaviors to obtain access to an adult, a peer, we want an object, or we need some additional sensory stimulation, or we're escaping, avoiding. And oftentimes there might be an overlap, but the goal of that assessment is to help us narrow down to give us the most likely hypothesis as to why we think under these conditions, those antecedents, this behavior is occurring because these are the consequences that seem to be maintaining it. And so now we're going to be going through a little bit here and talking a little bit about how we can take some of those classroom practices in that same vein and start talking about with behavior. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy for just a moment.
Thank you, Brooke. And it's important for us to remember as classroom teachers that we want to look at those ABCs because we don't need to be the expert in that, but we need to make a snap gauge of the situation so that we can make sure that we are appropriately responding in the classroom. So the first thing we started with when we were looking at the classroom essentials, and there are five, and they're not in any particular order, but we started today with the behavior because in the classroom, that's where the teacher normally starts to notice that there is something going on is with the behavior. And so this is the middle column of that, the observable, measurable piece of that. And we, as classroom educators, we want to make sure in every classroom that we are teaching, posting, reviewing, monitoring, and reinforcing a small number of positively stated school-wide expectations. And then aligned to those school-wide expectations are our classroom rules. And once we establish those, we want to explicitly teach them. We need to define in our typical instructional model, we're going to establish, teach, we're going to prompt the behavior, monitor the behavior, and evaluate how it is occurring or how the situation is going in the classroom. So then if we need to continue the cycle of instruction to reteach some of those behaviors that we are seeing happening skill gaps that we're seeing happening in the classroom. Part of what we can do in all three tiers in every classroom is remind students of the rule. And excellent ways of doing that are visual prompts. When I taught civics and we would do a writing lesson, I had my ACE writing strategy as an anchor chart on my wall. And every time I taught writing, I would reference that. First, we're going to answer, then we're going to cite, then we're going to explain. And think of your behavior anchor charts in much the same way. We have these visual prompts to keep things at the forefront of students' minds. And we can also reference those as we start to do pre-corrections, those verbal reminders or behavior demonstrations of the behavior that we want to see occur. And we have some examples here. This is a local elementary school in St. Johns County, Hartley Elementary, where some of the examples that they have of their behavior anchor charts around. And the bottom left was from a middle school or junior high science classroom with a reminder of in the science lab, jaguars are still safe in a science classroom. That looks like moving quietly, sitting quietly, performing your role. And then on the bottom right, we have a classroom behavior matrix that is according to the situational or instructional activities that are happening in the classroom and how those situational rules still apply or tied back to the school-wide expectations. And those can be utilized and referenced in every classroom.
All right. So, how does this connect back to that individualized instruction that's happening for that behavior intervention plan or that BIP? And so, when we're doing those assessments or when you're part of that team that's working on that assessment, we think of what are the skill gaps that our students might need. And so, excuse me, we may need to consider, is our student displaying behaviors that are preventing them from engaging in some of those academic activities? There may be escaping and avoiding that difficult task. And so, how do we identify what behaviors they need? Do we need to teach certain skills around problem solving? And so, we give you just some examples of how we can address behaviors that we want to teach. So, again, connecting back with some of the examples that Christy was sharing in the idea of teachers and classrooms define the behaviors and expectations, that helps gives us a little bit of guidance to let us know where is that skill gap and how are we going to adjust it in that individualized intervention plan. Does our student need specific coping skills? Because maybe we have that school-wide expectation around being responsible and using our words when there's conflict, but our student also needs to learn some additional cool down strategies. And so maybe we need to teach those specific skills and embed that within our classroom, because maybe we have a space in the classroom to teach a skill such as calming down, using deep breathing, things like that. But we need to identify how we're going to teach that and align it within not just the classroom, but also what that might look like for that individual student. So you'll see tables like this throughout today's chat. And our goal here with these tables, I'm not going to walk you through every little thing there, but is to identify these are, in this particular case, around behavior, the strategies around skills that you might want to teach, how that might connect to what you see in that hypothesis statement that's coming out. So if it's, escape avoidance type behavior, or it's under these certain antecedents, here's what you might be able to do and what to consider. So that's all this is here is focused on when we're thinking about what are the behaviors that student needs to teach or learn in order to be successful with their behavior plan.
On our next classroom essential, we're going back now to the antecedents. And this is where we're going to look at the environmental events that occur prior to the behavior. And in every classroom, when it maximize the structure, that's where we develop the routines for the teacher. We develop the routines for the students so that the classroom can become a predictable environment. We want to make sure that we are designing that environment to elicit appropriate behavior and help prevent some of the behaviors that we want to see decrease. And in the chat, if you could put in the chat box, what does it look like and sound like in your classroom or some of the classrooms that you support? What are some of the things that you're seeing and hearing that are helping to maximize structure?
Or what are some of the common routines that maybe you've had to establish in your classroom to help it run more smoothly? We'll give you just a minute to see if we get anybody's responses. One thing
And
that I want to share when I think about that individualized plan um, is, and I'm going to pull in some of the examples that are listed here. How are we arranging the classroom when we maybe have individual students who we know need additional cues, needs additional prompting? Are we putting them in position within the classroom where we, as that classroom teacher or maybe paraprofessional, are able to engage with them more easily and readily? Love the consistent, predictable routines. I see getting the attention. Yes, Rebecca, thank you. Attention signals are a huge one, especially for some of our students who might have some difficulty attending or are having other behaviors. We need to make sure that before we're even giving out instruction, before we're doing transitions, things like that, that we have their attention so that they can benefit from whatever it is, the next antecedent, if you will, right? So those are going to be some great predictable routines that we want to establish within the classroom.
Brooke, in the chat, we're seeing procedures for getting supplies, consistent, predictable routines like turning in assignments, using the restroom. And as you said, the attention getting signals. Other ways we can maximize structure and tailor this to the needs of all of our students. Timers. We can do digital clocks on the overhead. We could do a schedule at a glance. We could, on the right hand side, we have something that can be attached to a student's desk where there are Velcroed on pieces. Did I do this? Did I not do that with the morning routine and the afternoon routine? And possibly a little more of a secondary example down in the middle bottom there, but the reading workshop where it's broken into a how will my class period be broken up into time chunks so that a student can get an idea of, okay, this is my routine and I can anticipate there's going to be a change coming in just a few minutes. And then we go back to maximizing structure, Brooke, with the BIP.
Yeah, so just as Christy was describing, those are again some tools that can be used universally, but can we, do we need to break some of those things down maybe even further for some of our students? And oftentimes, some of the things that we might be using to help support an individual student are also going to benefit everybody. So things like those transition supports and really connecting back to your assessment and your planning. Maybe you as a classroom teacher already are using auditory transition supports. You've got music, you've got chants, you're doing all of that stuff, but then through the assessment, that student is not responding to those types of supports. Maybe they do require a more motor or visual type of transition support. So those are the types of things that you might be making those adjustments. So it's again the idea that we have these pieces already hopefully in place in the classroom. How can we scale them up to support the student based on their individual needs? So again, thinking again about that environment, does the student need more additional support with their schedule? Maybe they already have an idea of we do math, then reading, then lunchtime, but maybe to Christy's point, within that reading block, we need a better breakdown of what it's going to look like for them. So those are just different ways that we can take some of those tools and resources around structure to help support and scale up for that individual student. Nope, you're good. Keep going.
Sorry.
You're fine.
And then also, we want to actively engage all of our students in visible, observable ways. We want to, of course, provide high rates of opportunities for our students to respond. And in the chat, as we talk through these, if you could begin to type, what are some of the engagement strategies and tools that you use or you see used in the classroom that you support classrooms? We want to link in engagement with outcome objectives. Can we have choice boards? Can we, sometimes students do odd problems, sometimes they do even problems, 10 questions of your choice, challenges like this small group who can answer 5 questions first. And there are just a plethora of ways that we can engage our students, but we want to make sure that we are providing lots of opportunities for students to engage with the work that we want to see in the classroom. Some examples that we have of those, and we'll come back to the chat as people are typing. Um, some of those are choice boards, such as the tic-tac-toe choice board for a book report, an art history project, a novel choice board. Um, there are many different ways, like we said, that we could engage students. And I'm not seeing anything quite in the chat on there,
Not yet.
but they're
I,
coming. I know they're furiously typing.
I
And
will
then
say
also,
that, oh, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, this one, I think when we start getting at that individual student level, we really want to start considering, are there performance deficits or skill deficits that are contributing to the lack of engagement? Because sometimes the way that we have things set up classroom wide to help support engagement may not benefit the student that we're trying to target. And so that's really a lot of the examples we're trying to share with you. And we want to think about what you already have in place is our kind of like, have we cast a wide enough net at this class level to support student engagement? And then when we get at the individual level and we start thinking about that individualized plan, that's when we're going to think about what does this student need in order to benefit from, or not benefit, sorry, in order to engage in the instruction at that time. And then Kat, I see, she has the question. Any examples others have used in engaging instruction or alternate ways to have students show what they know?
And
Back.
moving forward, as people type other ways we can engage our students and have them engaging with instruction and attention to task, we can have students utilize flexible seating throughout the classroom, whether they sit on the floor, on a bag, or a chair that moves, or a chair that spins, whether they stand and do their work. It can help improve focus through movement. We also have fidgets that students can have. When I was a kid, we didn't call it a fidget, but I always had a paper clip that I rolled back and forth in my fingers. It helped me stay focused on what was happening in the classroom. But that helps through that sensory input and helps students regulate that as well. James in the chat said, I used to use a Velcro word sort wall in civics. I had 3 columns that I could switch out vocab words for students who wanted to get up out of their seats. Excellent. It might be executive, legislative, judicial with the words that would go under the appropriate column. That's a great idea. It's something that's still instructional based, but allows movement within the classroom so that they're still engaging with the material, but they are working to do that. That's a great idea, James. Thanks for sharing.
And I also actually think that really leads into sometimes also the way that we're creating those opportunities to respond, the way we're modifying the curriculum, because some of our students may not have all of the language skills to engage in those type of you know oral responding. And so we create nonverbal ways for our students to engage with the curriculum. We have those multi modalities Oh, we got lots coming in now. Yes, choice boards to show what we know, using different response cards, pointing, helping them understand and check throughout the lesson. Awesome. And that's what we're getting at, is that we want to have variety, not only in the classroom level, available. So again, to help prevent behaviors from hopefully, maybe ever showing up, but when they are showing, kind of going, what else can we maybe do or might be needed to our curriculum to modify? Do we have to break it into smaller units to get our target student to engage? Do we have to maybe sequence the task to build momentum with our student engagement around that task? Um, Again, do we have to have opportunities where what we call errorless learning, where they do a lot of practice with the getting basically kind of like positive feedback with every response that they're getting in order to build that momentum and continue to build their skill sets? Do we need to partner up with students who have the appropriate behaviors in order for them to engage with that academic task or that social task in an appropriate way? So the idea around building student engagement at that individualized level is to really think about what it is that that student needs in order to engage and benefit from that instruction. So, like the example there with the opportunities to respond, you likely already have lots of ways to engage within your classroom, whether it be choral, written, partner engagement during instruction. But for our individual student, we have to think, what are the salient cues and prompts that that child might need in order to engage? So really using those multimodalities there as well. I'm going to
Brooke, I
keep
love
going.
Lori's example in the chat before we move forward, where it incorporates an opportunity to respond for a student with a teacher's need for a check for understanding or CFU. So it allows them to gauge how instruction is landing in the classroom as they move forward through the lesson. And then we get to consequences of the ABCs. C is consequences, where these are the responses that occur to an inappropriate behavior or an appropriate behavior. And we want to have a range of a continuum of response for the consequences or interventions for problem behavior, so that we can make sure that we are responding and not reacting. These can be classroom managed behaviors on a discipline flow chart that a school team has in place of how a teacher might respond in a classroom. And these are also opportunities for students to practice some of those more acceptable behaviors. And there could be so many interventions or responses that could go into place. It might be eye contact, error correction. It could be planned ignoring. Prompts, or like we said before, the pre-corrections. There are many different ways or that we can respond to inappropriate behavior in the classroom, and guidelines for responding effectively. Now, first and foremost, is we always have to stay calm. We have to stay objective. My mentor teacher, when I was going through my education program, told me to praise in public, punish in private. Not that we're punishing, but we want to have those conversations privately if we are correcting behavior. We want to make sure that we are being behavior specific when we're giving praise and when we're giving behavior feedback, corrective feedback, where we label the inappropriate behavior and we name the expectation that wasn't met, and then replace it with the behavior that we would like to see moving forward. And going quickly through that, Brooke.
Excuse me. And this is really just to kind of highlight, when we think about how we're responding to when we see that inappropriate behavior, we want to make sure we remember sometimes that different behaviors, or sorry, behaviors that look the same may be serving different functions. So something like a student putting their head down may look like they're trying to escape doing their work or get out of that social situation, but they may also be trying to get comfort. Maybe they're not feeling well that day, or they haven't slept, so they're trying to access those types of things. And so that assessment tool of doing the assessment helps us identify those patterns. But when we think about planning our continuum of responding in the classroom, we want to make sure that we're addressing function through that continuum of responding. And then I think also On the flip side is we're going to start thinking about how are we responding and acknowledging the appropriate behavior. So that'll take us to our next slide. I want to make one comment with the reason that we're keeping that little graphic up there around this classroom practice aligns with consequence is because if you notice that bottom box there that's kind of highlighted in that red, when we understand what consequences are already available in the environment and what that student is receiving as part of those consequences, whether it be the response from the teacher for inappropriate behaviors or how we're being acknowledged, it helps us get clued into what might be motivating or maintaining that behavior or that function. So that's kind of the rationale around when we're thinking about consequences and what's available. It's helping us guide that assessment to help us get to function and hopefully identify what to use in the replacement behaviors for the BIP, which we're going to do that in just 1 second and then turn it over to Rebecca.
Yes. And as some of the ways we can acknowledge those appropriate behaviors is with, like I mentioned, the behavior specific praise, where we're, when we can, naming the student and naming the behavior that we want to see replicated. And this helps them to practice the skill or goal that we've set. We've got several examples there. Some examples are Jacoby during math. You follow directions the first time, so you earned your all of your points that you're working for. Some non-specific would be good job. And then, as always, we want to keep that positive to negative ratio high. We want to make sure that we're giving more positive statements than we are corrective statements. And then some examples of ways that we can do that are the caught you being good cards that we see, the punch cards, like in the middle, the best behavior, mystery mode, where we have students who are mystery students, and when they meet certain expectations of behavior in the classroom, then they get some sort of mystery motivator. And of course, the behavior specific praise again in the upper right hand corner. In the chat box, could you tell us some examples of acknowledgement or reinforcers that you see in classrooms that you support?
Maybe even some examples of how that might have even been individualized for a student as well.
I'm not seeing anything coming quite yet, but again, I know people are probably typing furiously. But in an effort of maintaining our time, oh, here we go. We use positive postcards. Thank you, Terry. Like that.
And positive postcards, a lot of times we'll see stuff that gets connected to that school-wide system, positive office referrals, positive principal referrals. Um, you might see like this best behavior punch card here. It might be something that is happening school-wide or class-wide. But then we can, depending on the value to the student, it could also be transitioned into an individualized behavior just for that student. So one thing that I want to point out as we move into those responding and reinforcing is this one's organized. This chart is organized just a little bit different. Oh, we got class compliments. Awesome. So catching teacher recognizes class for school-wide behavior, such as the hallway, the points. They get higher value when they're being recognized outside the classroom. And I want you to continue to think about how can we take something that's happening class-wide and layer in to support that individual student and connect it to that plan. So if we know hallway behavior, for example, and maybe we've got a student who's struggling with the transition, maybe we can incorporate reinforcement behavior around the line walking for that student, earning additional reinforces to the reinforcement for the class wide. Again, all that though is going to be contingent and it's going to depend on what was motivating or identified as reinforcing during that assessment. So this table here is organized slightly different than the other ones because we're taking both the reinforcement of a replacement behavior, one that's considered functionally equivalent, which means the student is going to, earn the same type of reinforcer. They're either going to get or obtain the teacher attention or escape or avoid, depending on what was maintaining that behavior. And so then how to connect it to that function and ways to consider that reinforcer. But the big takeaway here is that acknowledgement or that reinforcement really needs to be connected back to the data that was collected during the assessment. So having those systems in place at the school-wide and classroom level ideally are able to just kind of build on and how can we incorporate it and individualize it. One area that we know is an area of struggle oftentimes in the school and classroom is the discontinuing of reinforcing those inappropriate behaviors, right? A student's knocking over a chair, throwing materials. We can't just ignore it and hope it'll go away because we know that especially if that behavior is for attention, it's just going to be dangerous for that behavior to occur. So we really want to minimize the reinforcement around those inappropriate behaviors. I had a colleague one year that's really, we focused on if it's attention seeking behavior, we're going to minimize attention. We're not going to completely get rid of attention because it's dangerous if we were to do that. So really, those are just things to consider that we don't want to use that when the behavior is dangerous to themselves, others, it's overly disruptive to the classroom environment. We often know it's very difficult to do. And we often know that discontinuation of those reinforcement causes behavior to sometimes spike. So we really want to develop plans that are going to be reinforcing that new skill that we're teaching, maybe that alternate behavior or one that's functionally equivalent. So on that note, because we told her we were going to try and leave her 20 minutes, we left 18. We did pretty good, Rebecca. I apologize. This I know is what everyone's really waiting for is how do we take the idea of these classroom practices and begin to scale up what that looks like across the tiers so that when that individualized plan gets developed, it hopefully becomes a seamless transition because the goal of that plan is to find out what that student needs to be successful. And then from there, when we're starting to see improvements in behaviors, how do we fade out? And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Schmuck from Santa Rosa, who's the district coordinator, and she's going to share a little bit about how Santa Rosa has scaled up their supports from classroom to individual students.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm hopeful that what I share today is going to give you a look at one way that you could approach exactly what Brooke just describes, taking those tier 1 approaches and building on it at that tier 2 and tier 3 level. And in our county, we have a three-pronged focus that is the approach that we take. So Christy, if you can go to the next slide. One thing that we really focus on is having a central hub for training and resources. There's all sorts of data systems that you can use for this. I'll share what we're using in our district. We also have worked on having responsive identification of entry points, identifying what is bringing people to our hub and what is it that we can do to help them to quickly access the things that they have come to the hub to try to access. And then along with that, providing tiered training and organization so that at all times what we are presenting and providing for our teams is facilitating that movement from tier 1 all the way up to tier 3 if needed. So here's a look at our central hub. We use SharePoint and we have our Behavior Intervention and Support Resource Center, which is a really long name of what we in the district call our behavior toolbox. It is open to all of our district staff. So any teacher, anyone with a district email account can access the SharePoint. And you can see even from the entry page here that it's set up to have resources for different stakeholders. We have our MTSS process that mostly is accessed by our MTSS team leads, our school counselors, those stakeholders that are most involved with that MTSS systems approach. Those resources are located there. Then we have our behavior interventions page, and that's the page most frequently accessed by our teachers, our interventionists, those who are actively providing the interventions, whether it's at that tier 1 level and the classroom approach, all the way up to those tier 3 levels. And then we have our discipline information page where our deans might access it, our administrators, our assistant principals, those who are actually involved in administering discipline or maybe acting on discipline. So looking for ways to reduce exclusionary discipline, for instance. Those resources will be located there. So with this central hub, every training that we present, every resource we create is located somewhere in this hub. It gives us one location that our teams can access at any point to be able to have access to those resources and trainings. You got a glimpse at one of those entry points in that we look at which stakeholders might be accessing the MTSS process or interventions or discipline information. But we also looked at other reasons that teams might access the SharePoint. And the main reason that teams go to the SharePoint is because they need help. When we're talking about our teachers and our interventionists, if they have more behavioral knowledge, what Brooke was talking about today, thinking about the functions of behaviors, why are students engaging in these behaviors, what's motivating that behavior, then they might be interested in accessing interventions through the lens of those functions. So we have a function-based menu. You can see pictured here to the left that lists out the different potential functions and gives you interventions, an idea of how those interventions could address those specific functions. Then for our teachers or teams that might not have that behavioral knowledge, they may be coming to the SharePoint looking for, if you can go back to the previous slide for just 1 second, they may be coming to the SharePoint looking for help with a particular behavior. They don't know why the behavior is occurring. They just know what they're seeing in class. So we have a behavior-based intervention menu for that, where if they're seeing arguing or they're seeing hyperactivity or they're seeing non-compliance, they can come to this menu, they can look at the behavior descriptions and see if that's really matching what they're seeing in the classroom, and then they can get an idea of some interventions that could be used to address that behavior. We use that same behavioral categorization to structure our monthly forums. So every month we do a Behavior MTSS forum. And the last 2 years, so starting last year, continuing this year, we've structured it around behavioral categories like avoidant behavior, dysregulated behavior, attention-seeking behavior, which again ties to that entry point of a teacher coming to that training or accessing that training because of a particular behavior they're seeing. And then within that training, we then start building in that function-based knowledge and that function-based approach to interventions. This gives you an idea of how we approach that tiered training. So even within our trainings, we want to facilitate that movement from tier 1 up into our higher tier 2 and tier 3 approaches. So that first slide shows you our training goal sheet that's used in all of our monthly forums this year. And you can see the structure there. We're going to describe the behaviors, make sure that teams are aware of what we're talking about, what it looks like, and then moving into the function. Why could that behavior be happening and how can we then address it? Then we move into our tier 1 approaches. We look at best practices. We also look at some barriers that might be inhibiting or affecting some of those tier 1 approaches. Then we move into the tier 2 approaches, and really tier 3 is just intensification of tier 2. So both, are related there. And you'll notice for both of those that we're very clear with our teams that this applies for our students who have individualized education plans as well. It may look a little different for them, but the importance of addressing those function-based needs is just as important whether they have an IEP or are considered a general education student. And then we always end with some monthly MTSS tasks. You see a little icon down at the bottom of that slide. We do send these out to our MTSS contacts in PowerPoint format so that they can pull those slides, and if they want to present them school-wide and have a staff meeting where they talk about attention-seeking behaviors and talk through those tier 1 pieces or talk about the dysregulated behaviors and facilitate some of that tier 1 approach in their school, they have that available for them. Within the SharePoint, we have a similar organization system. When they click on behavior interventions, they can see a folder that says tier 1 resources and has all of those types of materials in it. And then they can also click on the intervention resources folder if they're moving to that tier 2 or tier 3 level, and then they can see that intensification of what's been presented at that tier 1 level. Here's an example within those presentations of how we help our teams move from the training to actually accessing the resources. So the top slide there, you can see how we've presented some of the tier 1 resources that could be used for that particular behavior. This presentation was the avoidant behavior presentation. So these were all things that could help teams with students who were avoiding tasks or avoiding things, maybe due to that lack of engagement that Brooke and Christy were talking about earlier. So some engagement strategies for them, some structure strategies. You see the visual there for independent work, the listening time versus question time. So a variety of tier 1 resources that could be used for addressing that behavior of concern. We also have a teacher tip guide. The one I've pictured there is for attention-seeking behaviors. So if you have a teacher that's coming to this hub and they have behaviors that are seeking attention in their classroom, this gives them ways to address it. It gives them an idea of what might be behind that behavior. So a really quick look at the function, and then a little checklist where they can check how they are doing at responding and providing that appropriate attention at a high enough frequency and intensity level to be able to compete with the power of that negative attention. On the bottom, you see a slide presenting the tier 2 and tier 3 resources. Now, this was the slide from last year because we typically try to highlight new resources each year. Because teams can access all of the previous year resources, we don't want to present the same thing year after year after year. So this slide is from last year, and then this year we're highlighting the newer resources. So along with the intervention specific resources, we have teacher guides to our different interventions. And then this year we are adding parent guides to each of our interventions. You see both of those pictured there. So here's kind of a deep dive. If we look at dysregulated behaviors, for instance, how do we help our teams move from tier 1 into that tier 2 or tier 3 level? So first, when teachers or teams access that intervention page of the SharePoint, they can click on that tier 1 folder. They can find the teacher tip guide talking about dysregulated behaviors. What are some ways that I can address it in my classroom? Then they can click on editable, printable resources. So they can be printed as is, but they can also be downloaded and edited to match their classrooms and their needs. So you see pictured there a classroom calming corner, more of an elementary level approach to managing dysregulated behaviors and teaching regulation skills. We also have printable cards. These are more for our secondary students. They're sized to fit inside an Altoids tin. So very small, very portable, and something that can be done class-wide. The teacher can have those tins available, but of course easily lends itself to that more individualized approach for a student who might be creating cards specific to them, or might not just have the card available in second period, but has a whole kit that they take with them from class to class. We have calming strategy posters. So just a variety of different things that can be done class-wide at that tier 1 level. If the tier 1 approach is not effective or is not enough for a particular student, then they can move to tier 2 by clicking on the intervention resources folder and then clicking on the intervention that they're looking for. So they've tried the classroom, class-wide calming area or calming kit. It's not effective for that student for whatever reason. They might decide that that student needs increased instruction, increased feedback, increased structure, those pieces that we look at that signify the need for a tier 2 intervention. Then they could move from those tier 1 classroom calming areas and click on the calming refocus area intervention to get some specific ideas of how to intensify that approach to the tier 2 and maybe even the tier 3 level. So within that tier 2 folder, the intervention folder, there's the calming refocus area teacher guide. There's also a parent guide now. Those are the pieces we're adding this year. And then they can also access, again, editable, printable supports that give them ideas of how to individualize that calming area for that student and maybe address some of those things that Brooke was sharing earlier. Maybe we haven't provided enough structure. Maybe we haven't provided enough feedback. Maybe we need some additional incentive or some additional motivation in order to encourage the student to use that area. So you see pictured there what that could look like. And then at the tier 3 level, we would be taking this and adding in additional prevention strategies, additional teaching strategies, and maybe some different response strategies specific to that student. So along with providing materials at the tier 1 and tier 2 level, we also have to teach our teachers and teams the difference between the tier 1 and the tier 2 level. In other words, just having a classroom calming area doesn't mean I'm providing a tier 2 intervention for a student who's struggling. So we provide visuals like this to help our teams understand the difference between tier 1 and tier 2. And again, we use that framework of instruction, feedback, structure, and motivation to help our teams be able to see what might be the difference between tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 1, I'm providing that instruction for everyone. I'm giving feedback to everyone. I'm defining structure, so that aligns with those 5 essential PBIS classroom practices that were talked about. I've got that structure set up for my whole class. And then I have my motivation, my engagement strategies for my whole class. At that tier 2 level, then we're looking at what am I going to do for that student? Because the instruction, my classroom lesson on using the calming area hasn't been enough to help that student use the area successfully. So I'm going to add some additional instruction, excuse me. I'm going to use some different resources. I'm going to add some different visuals to help that student understand how to use that area. Feedback is probably going to be a little bit more structured. I might add in a data tool where I'm actually meeting with that student and conferencing and giving them feedback on how did that area work for you? How long did you use it for? How did you feel when you came back? What can we, adjust to help it be successful for you? Looking at that structure, very similar, setting up what that area usage needs to look like for that student, and then motivation, possibly adding in an incentive. And I often find, this is just me personally sharing this, I often find that when we're looking at calming areas specifically and incentivizing, we have to look at incentivizing students, whether they remain regulated or use the area appropriately. So having kind of an equal incentive for those two pieces so that we don't accidentally incentivize a student for being dysregulated. So some of those pieces, we put out a kind of a standard visual like this, but then some of those pieces do require additional training to help our teams as they encounter maybe some different pitfalls in interpretation as they're going through and trying to apply what they see here.
I just want to add one thing, Rebecca, because I think that is a really nice example of progressing through tier 1, tier 2. And if we kind of keep thinking about when we get to tier 3, it's a lot about how precise we're getting in building our best. I hate saying guess because it's a guess that's based on a lot of data and a lot of information that's collected through the assessment process. But it's knowing what are those components that contribute to behavior and how precise and how drilled down do we need to get for that individual student in order for them to be successful. And I think this does a really nice job of describing that process really clearly across the tiers here. So thank you for sharing that. Sorry, go on.
No, that's all good. So this is just another example. I'm looking at avoidant behaviors. So when we teach our teams about avoidant behaviors, we do talk about that motivation piece. So we talk about those incentive pieces, but we also teach our teams about the importance of looking at other factors as well. So those skill gaps that Brooke was mentioning, those regulation needs, those resiliency skill gaps that they might be experiencing, and looking at what it is that the student is avoiding, that aversive task, that aversive activity. What can we do to help it be less aversive while we're also building skills and maybe adding some motivation? So we have those areas listed in the teacher guide to avoidant behaviors, and then you can see some of the printable supports that are really leaning into that incentive piece. If a teacher does not have a class-wide incentive system for that engagement piece, that's one of the first things that our teams, we typically look at is let's make sure we've got an incentive system in place. And then if the student's not responding to that, let's look at those other pieces and make sure that we're addressing those needs as well. Let's see, there's one slide right before this. Can go back just one. There we go. Thank you. At the tier 2 level, then let's say that the teacher has tried that classroom token economy, that classroom incentive system, and the student's not responding. Then they might go to that intervention resources folder and click on the folder for the token economy intervention. Different from your school-wide token economy, your classroom token economy, this would be individualized for that student. There's lots of different approaches and different ratios. So different expectations for how many things the student has to do in order to get that main reinforcer, that backup reinforcer. So you see some pictures there of individualized systems. We have star cards, we have earn cards, we have puzzle token time, lots of different approaches that might resonate with different students for different reasons. So lots of tools for them to use. And then at that tier 3 level, of course, we then build on maybe that prevention piece. So the things that we're going to put in place along with the token board, which might be some of those things to decrease the aversiveness of what we're also trying to motivate them to engage in. Then we have those teaching pieces that might be teaching those regulation skills. It might be teaching some of those other executive functioning skill deficits, whatever it is that's leading to that avoidance, and then building into our response and that incentive system. So one of the key things when we're talking about token economy specifically that we've tried to teach our teams is the importance of looking at that ratio, what we call ratio strain, when we've asked students to do too much in relation to what they're going to earn. So one way that we approached it is by giving kind of different names to these different frequencies or these different ratios, just to really help us make this really concrete for our teams in order to identify where we might intensify our interventions within our approach, even within that same intervention. So we have that basic token economy where we're putting down tokens towards that backup reinforcer. Typically, we would see this as a task series. They're doing reading, they're doing math, they're doing science, and then they're getting their reward. They're doing first period, second period, third period, and they're getting their reward, etc. So if the student is not responding to that, then typically we would move to that first then approach where they do reading, they get a reward. They do math, they get a reward. They do first period, they get a reward. They do second period, they get a reward. So our teams have a pretty good handle on that. Where we are working on, we're working on all of these, but one of the pieces I think is important to communicate to our teams is that first then is not the end. First then is not the most intensive approach. And Christy shared a little bit about this earlier. We might have to break down reading into what actually has to be done during reading. We might have to break down a particular center or a particular activity, like copying from copying into our planner, the task for the day. If we're thinking about our secondary students, we might have to break down what specifically that looks like with a token for each of those, or a point, if we're talking about secondary, for each of those subtasks, and then building into that reinforcer.
Rebecca, I do have to kind of start wrapping us up. Unfortunately, we have passed our 11 o'clock time frame. But I want to point out this first of all, it is her last slide. But what I think Santa Rosa has done such a beautiful job with is the organization. I love even on the bottom of this slide that you're not talking about this as the first thing that we're doing. We got to collaborate. You've set them up and you've set up your teams to have the coaching support around all of these interventions. And so a lot of what we shared today is the idea of, Christy, if you just want to go to our final slide real quick, is taking that content that we are trying to establish as those foundational practices in the classroom, and how do we continue to reinforce and strengthen the capacity of our classroom teachers, not only at tier 1, but also then to ensure that we're able to coach it with that level of precision. So I do apologize, but I wanted to make sure that those of you who are here, if you have a question, you want to drop it in the chat, please do that. I know there was a request for sharing out some of the recommendations and ideas from the chat. We're going to work on getting that out to you all. Not sure exactly how yet, but we know we can download the chat. I just don't know how we're going to share it out, if it'll go through email or maybe we can summarize it and post with the recording. But we really appreciate those of you who are here today. And if there's anybody who would like to have any questions, we'll hang out for just a minute. And please join us for any of our tier 3 think tanks we've got coming up, or if you're interested in joining us for any of our Tier 3 professional learning, we do have spring courses on brief FBA and BIP assessments available.